Hello. I'm just reading from near the beginning of the book. It's set in the late 60s, early 70s. At this point, it's the late 60s. A young man, Łukasz Kanowski, whose father is a drunk and an ex-RAF pilot, and his mother is in a mental hospital. So he's had a fairly disastrous upbringing in the Northeast, and he's decided not to go to university because he needs to visit his mother. So Luke chose the paper mill over the colliery, and his childhood ended. He was a junior assistant clerk, making £2 10 shillings a week. He worked from 8:30 until 5:30 and visited Elen every other day. At school, he'd been punished for his energy set to do sports and extra work, and had embraced it as a distraction and challenge. The exercise had helped him sleep. Now he was older, and the night times were vaguer and darker, but the world was too dark a place already, and agony easily come by, and so he would put the light on and write. He had no axe to grind, no wound to pick at. He had always found, an intense joy in blissful escape. He was a scientist of the imagination. He could travel. He wrote poems and plays, hiding them under his bed from his own critical eyes, kept a diary and learned to play a second-hand guitar. He read newspapers, The Enemy and Melody Maker, all the way through and through again, even the ads at the back, and stored them with the poems under his bed. He had a shilling pay rise. He obsessed about chord changes, key changes, rhyme schemes, and Shakespeare, reading 3 or 4 books a week, exhausting the library's parochial shelves. He enjoyed the librarian's girlish thrill at the arrival of a new Agatha Christie or James Bond, and chatted to her about the characters and plot twists. He read Plato, Proust, to see what all the fuss was about, and The Collector 3 times, Raise High the Roof Beam over and over, A Clockwork Orange twice, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. He read anything, everything, and then his Shakespeare, again and again. He was promoted to assistant clerk. Believing he had grown out of religion, but fascinated by what he saw as the Catholic fetish of suffering, he built a crucifix in the middle of his bedroom out of broken glass from the bottles his father threw away. He used the pieces of glass with the labels for the Christ figure, and in his youth thought himself ironic. He went to the pictures every week, in Seston or on the bus to Lincoln. Bonnie and Clyde, Blow Up, Belle de Jour, Cul-de-sac, films that were like visitations from exotic gods, shocking, beautiful glimpses of other minds, and evidence that it wasn't just his eye that was a distorted, highly colored lens. He sat through them 3 or 4 times until he lost the narrative and just counted the beats of the shots, saw patterns in the cuts, and felt the shape of the story like music. Then he'd watch them again. The physical world shrank. His inner horizon took scale. He bought a television, and his father, at first suspicious, quite soon became attached to it, falling asleep to the national anthem each night and waking to the high-pitched, closed-down shriek. Luke caught him staring at it after he switched it off, sucking the last of the life from the fading white dot as the screen went black. When Luke watched the television, he sat with his knees to his chest, as close to the flickering, static-furred glass as he could get. He watched all the plays on the BBC, wrote down the names of the playwrights, and transposed the dialogue in a high-speed scrawl, not looking at the page. And the songs. The songs. There was a party going on somewhere, and he wasn't at it. He ran down the batteries on his radio late at night, looking for anything that had even half the energy that he had. Every week, he heard something that broke the week before into pieces. Music that was splitting its skin with every hour, growing up and getting younger. The Who, Them, the Stones, the Kinks, Aretha Franklin, James Brown, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan. He hadn't known music could grow up like that. He hadn't known there was a mind so big in it. He bought all the records he could afford, watching the vinyl and the labels, the spinning words the right way up, angled, upside down, all the way round at 45 RPM. The life inside him was tearing him up, writing himself inside out in lined paper notebooks, rushing and looking and working and moving, but knowing all the time that he was just staying still. He wore a narrow black tie and white shirt. He greased his hair back. He let it grow. He grew sideburns. He shaved them off. He washed the grease out. He cut his hair. He grew it again. He got a job on Saturday nights at the Working Men's Club that had bands play once a week between the bingo and the comic, fighting off every would-be pop star and Romeo in Seston to get it. And when he did, he felt as if God's hand had pointed down, and his great voice had said, "Yes, Łukasz Kanowski, you will work behind a bar, and you will meet girls, and there will be music." And he did, and there was. Most of the music was very bad, because Seston wasn't exactly a major stop-off on the touring circuit. It even knew itself it was a pathetic, half-dead place. But if the music wasn't up to much, the girls were easy harmony. Almost all the girls had something about them that sang. They smelled the same, hairspray and mentholated cigarettes, thick, perfumed lipstick. Jill, Sheila, Sandra, Mavis, tough girls who took care of themselves and made sure he knew he mustn't do anything, but then always made sure he did, wanting the heat of what they ought not do, and no babies. Christ knew Luke didn't want babies either, and he found ways of doing anything but the one thing they both wanted, taking Catholic pleasure in the ache of holding back. He had to be ingenious. He was. He used his imagination in the toilets of the club, in the alley behind his house, at the bus stop near theirs, in front gardens, back gardens, on buses and on benches, and discovered the thrill of female pleasure like a blessing was enough to still the constant seeking frenzy of his mind. So there was no mill office next day, no asylum, no father, no mother, just that girl, her heat, and smiling, whispered refusals. Could he get this far, this, until it was over, and he was left alone, satisfied if she was brave enough to touch him back, and frustrated if she wasn't, and like a cold rain falling, the truth of his life would return to him. He got another pay rise. He went through a phase of switching his accent at work every day to see if anyone at the mill office would notice. He jumped from French to Polish to Lincolnshire to extreme upper class, but the only nickname that stuck was the Frog. He was working as an assistant clerk in a paper mill and being called the Frog. He was going mad. Thank you.
Hello. In the Second World War, in the early first couple of years of the war, at Winston Churchill's instigation, the Special Operations Executive was formed to send Allied agents behind enemy lines in occupied countries. And the first people who were sent tended to be tough commandos, daring-do types. But as the war carried on, and the army developed intelligence about all the different countries around Europe and beyond, what happened was that you had boffin types back in the centres of intelligence in England, various country houses, like Bletchley Park, where the code breakers were, and in Cairo, where the headquarters for the Middle East, which covered the Balkan areas, were. And as the war went on, the chiefs realized that actually these boffin-type people, the people who actually knew what was going on and the kind of different factions involved in places like Greece, Albania, and indeed Yugoslavia, that they were the best qualified people and to be sent in to occupied Europe. And this book is about one such man called Tom Friedman, and who, with two other British soldiers, is parachuted into Slovenia in 1944 into the south, and then their mission is to trek into the north of Slovenia to coordinate the dropping of Allied weapons for partisans on the ground to use for sabotage. And this is of an episode from their passage north. They walk through lush pastures, stained yellow with patches of buttercups that have flowered overnight, a beautiful rash on the skin of the earth. After a while, the amblers coalesce into a single file, sharpening as they thread their way forward from the safe area around Semic through green, lustrous valleys, becoming more like soldiers as they do so, solemn, alert. Passing by nettles, Tom notices for the first time in his life the musky scent they give off. It seems he is less the single unified personality he had thought of himself as than a wireless receiver of signals that he's gradually becoming attuned to. The partisans are armed with German rifles, some captured here in Slovenia, most in North Africa and dropped by Allied planes. Jovan, the leader of the patrol, carries a Schmeiser machine pistol. They pass a section of single-track rail line. It is being repaired by men under partisan armed guard. Jack, Tom's senior officer, pauses when he realizes from their dirty uniforms that they are German prisoners. He finds this amusing, considering what his team aim to do further north. No doubt the Hun will use forced labor to repair whatever we manage to destroy, he proclaims. Thin, pale cows graze in a leisurely, deliberate manner, as if to make clear to anyone watching that it will take more than war to make them hurry. Walking through a wood, they come across a hollow full of sheep, where they surprise two uniformed men lounging by a tree. At the sight of Tom's group, the two men break into a run. Jovan runs after them, shouting, "Ustavi ali bomba estrelil!" He lifts the strap of his rifle over his shoulder, but before he can raise it, another soldier has taken aim. There are 3 loud cracks. One of the fleeing men halts and throws his arms in the air. The other staggers and rests a hand against the trunk of a beech tree. He appears to ponder his predicament a moment before coming to the decision to sink to the ground and then roll onto his back. Tom stumbles over after Jovan. The wounded young man has a downy moustache, the sort that is barely worth shaving. He is gasping for breath, staring up through the leaves of the tree above him. A bullet that entered his back has come out of his chest. The day is warm, but the other youth is shivering. He seems to be trying to swallow, but cannot do so. His Adam's apple shifts weirdly at his throat. Jovan looks at him angrily. "Why did you run?" he demands. The youth can only shake his head. The boy on the ground stops panting. "Where do you live?" Jovan asks. The youth points a trembling arm. "Go," Jovan tells him. He gestures to the dead boy. "Get some help to take him home." By the sheep, they find 2 rifles with cartridge belts leaning against a tree. The young members of the Home Guard had been milking the ewes. The partisans offer their English guests the milk. Tom's shaking hands will not hold the bucket still. He tries to drink. Milk spills down his front. The partisans, laughing, take the pail from him and pass it round amongst themselves. When it is finished, they set off again. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I hope that's given you a sense of a little bit about these stories. I'd like to begin by asking you both about the origins of these novels and the historical settings. And Tim, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your dedication, because you've dedicated this book to your father, and I wondered if there's a family connection with this, I guess, quite little-known campaign that went on in Yugoslavia.
Yes. Yes, definitely. My dad, he was in Yugoslavia, and it was a story that he always wanted to write about. He was a priest, and he died shortly after he retired. He was always looking forward to his retirement, and he was going to do what he'd done when he was a young man. He'd published some short stories in London magazines, but then his work kind of took over, as it does, but he died before he could write what he wanted to. So I kind of always known that this realm was there to be written about. He was not exactly the same as the young man in the book. He was a student at Oxford in his second year at Oxford when war was declared in 1939, and he volunteered and was in the artillery and took part in the Battle of El Alamein. And then when that was over, when it was won, and the British regiments were being brought back to Britain in preparation for the Normandy landings and so on, the Western Front, he was ill. He wasn't injured, but he was ill. He had malaria, and he stayed behind. And he found himself in the summer of 1943 in Cairo, in a bar, got chatting to another British officer, and on their fifth gin and tonic, this other guy revealed that he was in intelligence, and he told my dad that he thought surely artillery would be very boring, and he ought to, get into intelligence work. So persuaded him to come along the next day to an address that he gave him on a scrap of paper. And my dad found himself being interviewed by 3 colonels who asked him about his life and his thoughts and things. And he said, what do you know of communism, young man? And he said, nothing really. I'm not particularly a political animal. And he said, okay, and what do you know of Yugoslavia? And he said, well, I've never been there. I'm really sorry, I don't know much about it. So they finished the interview. They said, just sit over there, and he went over there. But he could hear what they were saying, and he could hear the chief, the head of this trio, saying, young man knows nothing of communism, nothing of Yugoslavia, seems ideal for the job. And 6 weeks later, having done a crash course in sabotage, sending wireless signals, and learning Serbo-Croat, he was dropped in as a number of other people were also being dropped into different parts of Yugoslavia with 100 gold coins in his belt to find and organize a resistance to the occupying Germans. The Italians, who also occupied parts of Yugoslavia, had just capitulated. And what he found was a fully organized partisan army, and his orders were then changed. So that's how he got involved. So that was, so I always knew, and he was a kind of, I think men, women who have been in war tend to either clam up and not talk about it afterwards, and he was the other sort who were quite happy. So my sisters and my childhood was, filled with stories of the war. So yeah, it was always kind of there. But it's not actually, when I actually came to write the novel, eventually the time came, his particular experiences didn't fit into a novel. Real life didn't have the structure that's necessary. So it's actually a completely different story, but the same idea.
It's a bit of it. It's all informed by what he went through. Yeah. So, fantastic. Sadie, you've chosen this world of sort of 1960s, 70s radical theatre at a time when London is changing quite dramatically, and these 4 young people, and then various people that they're involved with, setting up their theatre company, getting involved in that world. And I wondered, I know your mother was an actress, I wondered if you had a family connection with this period of history, and whether that was perhaps what inspired you, or what drew you to write about this?
Well, it was sort of accidental, really. I mean, my book is dedicated to my parents. But I came at it because I was preoccupied with the idea of writing a love story, a sort of capital L, not a romance, but it just seems, it's sex and death. I thought I wanted to look into what it is, what romantic love is, and its pitfalls and how it's very often destructive. And in kind of examining what I meant by that and what I wanted to tell, it just seemed that, I'm not sure when it was theatre, but it came into the early 70s very easily. It just seemed that was the place to put a story, a romantic love story. We had this sort of idea in the 70s. It seems to me that romantic love as an idea grew up then in popular psychology, in our psyches. The 50s was sort of innocent and boy meets girl, and the 60s we all had this illusion that we were free. Then in the 70s it all sort of seems to land and come home to roost, and from very high culture to low culture, romantic love was very sophisticated in songs and in plays, and it just seemed it had to be there. And then the people in the story, it's kind of a life or death story in a way that it's essential. And the main male character is a writer, the woman is an actress. And so I wanted to write about theatre, but theatre now is somehow, even though there's wonderful work going on, it seems peripheral in a way that in the 70s it was so essential to our culture, and if there was a play, everybody saw it. If there was a book, everybody read it. And I wanted to have that feeling. I was fascinated by that politically. So I began to think, well, it's going to be this writer and this actress, and they're going to be in the 70s. And then I thought, oh, my father's a writer, and my mum was an actor. And everybody we grew up with was actors and writers. And it was a sort of horrible moment where I realized that I don't ever really write about myself at all, and I don't knowingly write about my own stuff. But I had to kind of separate myself from it and not talk to anybody. These people are actually younger than my parents and older than me. But I came at it as if it weren't anything to do with my life. But actually, I suppose it sort of is.
It's interesting that you mentioned that that idea of, I suppose, the sort of possibility inherent in creating theatre then, because these are people who are idealists, and they're artistic idealists, but also politically they're idealists. And I know exactly what you mean, that, you know, young people in their 20s now perhaps don't feel that same kind of sense of possibility.
Or if they do, they express it differently. I mean, then it was the written word and it was the theatre. And there was the thing about the early 70s that if you had a white van, you had a theatre company. There was theatre and education, and there was very political theatre.
Yeah.
And but there was an urgency to it that I think now it's marginalised.
Well, and there's also, and Tim, you've also, you're dealing with young people, particularly the Slovenians, and Jovan, who is not Slovenian, but this group of people who are political idealists, who really believe that at the end of the war they are going to build a better future, and they're going to build a sort of brave new world. That it's, I suppose, from our vantage point, looking back at everything that's happened in the Balkans since and everything that's happened to communism, it's how difficult was it to recreate that sense of idealism that we've perhaps lost a bit?
Well, you're absolutely right, Stephanie. That was something I really wanted to engage with, that feeling of that you really can play a part in creating a better world. And also, you mentioned the youth. When I was doing research for the book, I was reading one bit about some British commandos on the island of Vis, who there was a regiment put together in America of second-generation Yugoslavs, who second-generation immigrants whose parents were emigrated from Yugoslavia, and they were brought back as a kind of fighting unit to join in this war. And the British commanders couldn't take them seriously at all, these people, because their officers were so old. They were in their late 30s. And that kind of brought it back to me, the thing of, and my dad, you know, he had this incredible war, incredibly interesting. His kind of personality was forged in the crucible of war, and he was 25 years old. And of course, you know, war is fought by the young. So that was, you know, something that I kept on being caught short by, realizing that they were so young. But this sense of idealism, certainly, I said that the actual experiences in the book are different from my dad's experience, but his kind of moral journey, I wanted to be the same, which is that of a kind of callow young man, English, sheltered upbringing, very particular ideas about how the world is, and being thrown into the Balkans and being amongst these idealistic communists. And some British just never got beyond seeing the whole thing as a bit of a joke, bit of a jape, kind of camping with guns in the mountains with these ruffians, these people who didn't clean their rifles properly and, you know, didn't wear the right uniform. And those, like my dad, who became enchanted, really, entranced, and became quasi-communist. At the end of the war, he was being debriefed, and he was the officer debriefing him had to leave for a moment, the office, and there was a filing cabinet with names on it, and my dad had a quick look in and found his own file, and it said, Pears is clearly a fellow traveller and needs to be kept a close watch on. So he took the file out and put it in his pocket and took it home, threw it away. But right at the end of the war, he saw what was done by the communists as the kind of the victors' justice, and terrible things happened at the end of the war. And my dad saw some of them, and so he went through this, in a very, very short period of time, at a very young age, he went from callow Englishman to believing that you could change the world and create a better world, and being enchanted by the people who were doing that, to being disillusioned in a short space of time, which is amazing, really.
It's very interesting, I think, because obviously these two novels have such different settings, but I think they do have certain similarities, and you've also got this young man who's had a rather sheltered upbringing, who is kind of flung, when he finally gets there, thrown into the kind of midst of everything that's happening in London in the late 60s and this world of political theatre, and has to grow up very quickly. In fact, all your characters, it's a journey of kind of, I suppose, a very a crash course in growing up.
Well, they're all, I mean, Luke, sheltered, not a word I'd use.
No, perhaps that's not, yeah, I suppose
it's more a sort of prison, really.
Perhaps,
yeah. But he, because he's a carer for his father, and he's a sort of self-imposed prison in a way. But he lives in a, I'm fascinated by, you often hear on the radio or see in interviews that there are people, actors or writers who grew up, without a book in the house, or who never met an actor, and they just knew that that's what they were. And he's a creature, Luke. He is that. He's just he's an artist, and everything to him is wonderful. That isn't reality, or that isn't his own reality or his own life, and he just he seeks and loves everything that isn't what has held him back. And that was interesting to me also. I mean, they're all young, they're all coming from, it's really a story of everybody in it, in the book, is trying to overcome the patterns that have been laid down for them by their pasts. I mean, Luke's is damaging in one way, and Nina's is damaging in another. She has a very controlling mother and who has not lived with her or brought her up. And so they're all seeking to fill the holes that their childhoods have made in them. And it's really a story about whether we can, we decide to do that, but whether or not we can do that. And if you're sort of doomed to follow the path. And it was the phrase that romantic love is a meeting of two pathologies that I heard. And it was something that just struck me as absolutely true, that there's a feeling that we have when we meet someone, particularly when we're young and before we've worked out our own messes, where you meet someone and you recognize them and you don't know why you recognize them. And I sort of wanted to map what that is and where it can lead, which isn't always a good thing.
Well, it's extremely powerful, I think. There's a sort of interlocking series of very complicated love stories in this book. And I wondered if we could talk about that a bit, because the event's been loosely titled Damage, and I think you've both got these very complex emotional situations between your characters where it's not straightforward. But perhaps you could tell us a bit about these central love stories and why, because they are very powerful, but they're also very difficult. They're very difficult emotional situations.
Yes, and well, it sort of it was kind of it's cruel, and I think life and love can be particularly cruel because we have this idea that it will fix us, but it's in fact the thing that is going to destroy us completely. And Luke, because of his upbringing, has a sort of pathological need to save, to kind of be a little bit reductive about it. And Nina, from hers, has a fantasy of being saved. And she's something of an emotional black hole. And then there's another character, Lee, whose father was serially unfaithful to her mother, and she has an absolute determination not to fall for that sort of a man, which doesn't go well. So yes, I have. It's interesting to me the feeling of the illusion of things being preordained, that romance is preordained, when in fact I think it's quite scientific.
And I think, and that idea of, I suppose, the dramatic possibilities of putting people into I suppose, a love triangle, although in your book it's not it's far more complicated than a love triangle. I don't know what kind of shape it is, but it's...
I veer between a double love triangle and a love quadrangle.
Exactly. But I suppose at the heart of that is this possibility of betrayal and investing trust in someone and being disappointed. And Tim, you've got a love triangle of sorts, although not a conventional one. In your book, can you perhaps tell us a bit about why it was important to have those personal stories at the heart of this, much wider story about war and...
Well, yeah. So the triangle in this book is Tom, the young English officer, Jovan, the Serbian tough communist, committed communist soldier, and Maria, who's a member of the group, who's a crack shot, a very good shot, and. I mean, again, it's one of the stories growing up that was a female partisan, so I always kind of took it for granted that women were fighters in the forest, partisans of one kind or another. They tend to be small groups, and they tend to be meritocracies, so that the leader of a group could be a professor or a peasant, a man or a woman. As in For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway. In those conditions, a woman is just another fighter. And in the Yugoslavia, sex was absolutely forbidden because that could have been catastrophic for what might happen in the moments of battle. So if a woman became pregnant, a woman soldier became pregnant, she was just shot, executed immediately, and so was her lover. So that was kind of, I knew about that, and I knew that my father had fallen in love with a female partisan, and they couldn't do anything, but at the end of the war they could do something, and he lost his virginity at the age of 25, whatever, with this partisan soldier, and being a good English gentleman brought up properly, he proposed to her and asked her to come back to England with him, but she, being wiser than him, said no. And so I thought that's, it's an interesting thing, having a woman in a small group, and Tom is quite young and quite unformed and doesn't know she's attracted to him. Is he attracted to her? But he's also drawn to Jovan, the leader of the group, but he's really discovering who he is, and that's part of his journey is not only discovering the politics and so on, but also his own inner yearnings. Yeah. And I have to say, I read Sadie's book, and I loved that. It's a wonderful book, but I loved that play. You're saying, is it preordained? These people kind of there are truths that they kind of know immediately of their feelings for each other, and yet know they shouldn't act on them, and yet have to act on them. And I thought that's so clever, that was.
So it's that rather sinister phrase, people being made for each other, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, I certainly felt that reading this, at the risk of sounding terribly old and cynical, but it is that when you're the age that these characters are, there's that absolute belief that, when your eyes meet across the room, as Luke's and Nina's do, that if there's that sort of instant recognition, which you describe so beautifully, and it's so vivid, and then, but trying to make that work in reality, and particularly in terms of the constraints that are placed on them by their circumstances. But I wonder if we could talk a bit about these female characters, because you both do have these very complex and striking female characters. And I wondered if you could perhaps tell us a bit more about your two main women and sort of where they came from and what inspired you about that contrast between them.
The two central, the women are Lee and Nina. Nina is, I found her really hard to write in a way, because she's sort of, because she's slightly Luke's nemesis, but also because she's difficult, she's manipulative, she's everything that women don't want to think that we are. And I found I had to be quite brutal with myself. She's cowardly, and she wants to be looked after, and she's deeply insecure, and she's sort of everything that in oneself, especially as a modern woman perhaps, you want to grow out of and turn away from. And yet she's I found her deeply sympathetic and tragic character, and she's formed by this appalling mother. And Lee, I found very difficult to write in another way, because she is a tough, strong, quite sorted woman, and I'm sort of to find her fatal flaws and her feebleness. She took some finding, but in a way they're opposites, and in a way they're both brought low by the same things.
Well, exactly. And it's difficult to I don't want to give too much away about the story, because I'm sure you will all want to go and read this if you haven't already. But Nina, exactly what you're saying. I found at times I wanted to shake her.
She's very discomforting.
Yes, she is. She does make you feel very uncomfortable, because you want her to assert herself particularly within
and
her
she does try
relationship. She does try, and yet she does she does make heroic gestures. And no, I thought she's a fascinating female character. I think because she's so complicated. And how much of those two women did you feel was informed by the period that you're writing about? I suppose just on the kind of cusp of.
I didn't feel they were sort of women of their time. I think they're women of any time, but they are, as you say, very affected. Lee is a feminist, and she's a very angry, powerful, rightly angry, and Nina is absolutely trapped. There's a scene she plays a part of her main role that she's successful in the theatre as a part of a female prisoner, and she's coming back from the theatre one night down through Soho in a taxi, and there's just prostitutes and peep shows, and that seems very much. Of course, it's still exactly like that, but it was. To her, there's almost no other choice, but to Lee, there's no other choice but to be angry and to find freedom. So I think we find in our time, we find whatever it is that speaks to our condition, I think. In the way that your guy, yeah.
And Maria, well, you've sort of answered that really, because I really was dying to know if she's based on a real person that you'd come into contact with or heard stories about. Were there many women like this whose stories were easily available, or did you have to kind of go seeking out?
No, there were. I mean, in the research, I mostly all my books up until this have been really about contemporary life or the very recent past, and this is the first historical novel that I've written, and I kind of disappeared into the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And I had to be dragged out again, really, by my wife and publishers, because it was just great. And I realized what the kind of the pleasure, this kind of strange pleasure of being an academic, of kind of just going off into research, ever more minute, abstruse avenues. But anyway, I read I think every account by an Allied officer or soldier of their time in Yugoslavia. And so I kind of pieced it together, really. And there was one woman in particular who was a crack shot, who a man called Bill Lawrence fought with in Serbia, in resistance there, and also a man called Milovan Žilas. His wife was a partisan soldier, and they were separated. They were in separate units, and she was shot and died before he could get to her. And the people she was with told him, and I put this in the book because I found it very touching, that they told him that as she was dying, she hummed a song to herself as she was dying. And he said, well, yeah, what song was it? What was it? What was the tune? And none of the three men could remember. And he was so distraught, he wanted to know the tune that she hummed to herself. So, yeah, it was kind of pieced together, really. And I also went to Slovenia, and I had a fantastic time when I was introduced to these very elderly people around this town of Samic who had been peasant partisans as teenagers, and they told me their stories, and that was
I was going to ask you about that, because it's so vivid, the descriptions of the landscape and the people and these villages that they're passing through. I was going to ask you whether, how many people really are still around that were able to give you first-hand accounts. Was that a big part of the research?
It was. There were really not many people. I mean, they're in their late 80s, early 90s, who were teenagers then, in the 1940s. So it was great to meet them, but it was also great, as you know, as novelists yourselves, I had to go there and walk in the mountains just to know what it smelt like. You can spend as long as you like in a library, but you have to know what things smell and look like and so on. And that was most pleasurable time, really, being on my own. I was in the south with these people, and the interpreter, who was kindly interpreting for me, and she said, "Oh, you're going to the north. You can't go on your own because there are bears all over Slovenia. You mustn't go on your own in the mountains." But I didn't see any bears, unfortunately. But that was the best time, really, just being on my own and imagining where these people were up in the mountains, in the
It's
forests.
really interesting hearing you say about all the research and your father's story, and because reading it, and I, at the risk of doing the "I loved your book too" thing, but I really loved his book too. It seems so. I very often, and I'm sure, when you read a historical novel or you read and you think that, I often think about the research the person had done, and because it's so present and it's so active and so specific, it didn't cross my mind at all what research or where you had found it. I just thought, oh, here's this thing that was true that happened.
Oh,
and the series of his loves, his falling in love with the land and out of love with God and in love with that officer, and it seemed to me as a series of loves that he finds before he finds that one. Do you think that's?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, very good description. Yeah.
And those smells and the places, absolutely.
Yeah.
Lyrical.
What kind of, because I know you've got a fantastic bibliography of all these wonderful kind of memoirs from 70s theatre at the back of your book, but was there a point where you had to sort of leave the memoirs and walk around backstage in theatres, or how did you get yourself into that 70s London?
Well, I felt, because I sort of grew up, because I was a young child, I felt I breathed the air of it very easily, but I had to research it to find the facts and the sort of backup structure of the actuality of it, because my sense of it was very easy to access, but I needed to know exactly, when that play was written and when this had happened, and to pin it down. And I did a lot of research. I did read a lot. And then I went to interview a man who wrote about 70s theatre. And I was interviewing him at the South Bank, and I was about 2/3 of the way through the book. And I was asking him all these questions. And as I said them, I realized that I could have asked my godfather, my father, my mum, virtually anyone but I had this sort of, I shut a door to it to make it other and to make it not, I made it much harder for myself than it had to be because I couldn't think. It was a very nerve-wracking thing to write. Not just because of the personal stuff, but also because of the writing at that time. I admire it so much. And I was thinking, well, here I am writing this world, where Pinter was. And I'm writing a playwright. What am I doing? And then I had this sort of moment of release about it, where I thought, Pinter didn't know he was Pinter. All these people are jostling, and nobody knows who's going to be remembered in 30 years. You're all just trying to get a play on, or get the money to do this, or pay your rent, and hating that critic, or So it was kind of a relief to just think it's just the world. No one knows that future, and to just be in the present of it.
And did you give it to your parents to read after you'd finished it, or did you ever ask their advice during the writing?
I didn't ask at all during. When it was finished, I gave it to first readers were actors who'd been around then, and my parents, and yeah, it was quite nerve-wracking.
And they gave it the thumbs up, did they? They said,
yeah,
good.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you one more question before I give the audience, because if you'd like to have a chance to ask some questions. But I wanted to ask, because you both started out from a sort of more dramatic background. Tim, I know you trained as a director. You studied as a director. And Sadie, you were a script writer, writing plays and film scripts before you came to novels. And I wondered how that background of being in these other forms of storytelling, how you feel that's influenced, or what you've brought from that to the way that you write fiction. Can you... Either of you. You're nodding.
No,
yes.
I don't think there's... for me, yeah, I made a few short films and did a directing course at National Film School, but I don't think there's any influence at all from filmmaking. I think in my brain they're completely different activities. Writing is grappling with language, with the plasticity of language, and creating sentences, which I think is completely different. But you just remind me, I just got to tell a quick story that thinking of the 70s, but my second novel was made into a TV series that I had nothing to do with in the end. And it was made into a 10-part TV series by the BBC, and it was a story of a family from shortly after the end of the Second World War through to the 1990s. And they invited me along to filming once or twice, and one time was when they were reenacting a concert by The Clash, punk concert from 1977. And they were filming in 2000, okay, so it's almost 15 years ago, so in 2000. And I went along, and there were all these young people with mohair jumpers and safety pins and dyed hair, and and for me, in 2000, it was yesterday. Okay, I was there, and it was very good. And I got chatting to the makeup girl as she was doing something, and I asked her how she was enjoying it, and she said, "Oh yes," she said, "I do love period drama." That was tough. Anyway, the 70s.
Yeah.
It's not so long ago.
No.
And yet, I suppose, getting those details, making sure you've got those details exact, because even as a child, that you miss from, because there are still people who know and who were there will remember it very vividly. You've got to be very clear about.
Yes, it's less. It was less the history of it, I suppose, than just what it feels like, the reality of it, because you have your own truth about it. But if you're writing particularly theatre is a very closed world, and also, writing war, I guess. I wrote a novel that was a war novel, and I had to not tell myself that it was a war novel. Were you daunted by that as a thing, as a heading? Because I find writing a war novel or a book about theatre, I find those things very daunting. Do you feel that overshadowed by the other stuff or not?
Yeah, I'm not particularly. I'm not sure, but one of the things I found that I quite enjoyed doing was using archaisms and the way that people talked and little phrases and things, and just kind of dropping them in to people's speech or descriptions to validate it. But there's always a danger that it becomes almost kind of like a kind of pastiche, you know. So you got to get a fine line. And I thought, reading yours, you managed to not have that. It wasn't an issue. You didn't seem to play with the way that people spoke.
Well, you're right. It's like putting in. It's when it tips into pastiche, or you sort of find, you know, particularly with late 70s, late 60s, early 70s, there was a sort of whole kind of groovy kind of thing that was a sort of horrible demon at my shoulder that I was not going to fall into.
But
I wanted to kind of, I wanted to suggest it and have the feeling of it without kind of laying it on with a trowel.
Yeah. It's a good game, isn't it, when you're writing? A couple of times somebody just says, you know, what do you think of this man?
Right.
Yeah. And that's about it. That's about the limit.
And a little goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, if we can have the lights up, we've got a few minutes. If anybody would like to ask Tim or Sadie any questions about these books or previous books, if you've read others. Yeah, there's a gentleman there. There's a microphone coming round.
I found this discussion very interesting, actually, and I'm afraid I didn't know either of you as authors before I came here, but I've enjoyed the discussion, and I will buy both books and read both books. But I don't want to know the end of either book, but do I take it that I won't find a particularly happy ending at the end of either of these books?
I don't want you to answer that because I've got 20 pages to go on yours, and I can cover my ears and sing.
Happy ending. Don't worry. Fine. Yeah.
I sort of hesitate to say because I've been told it's happy.
Well, I think there's a difference between a sort of happy ending and an optimistic ending, and I think actually both of these have an optimistic ending, even if they're not conventionally what you might predict. And actually, well, I think with both of them, it's very difficult to predict the ending because they do, you know, they keep you guessing. But I felt there was a note of optimism in both of the books, regardless of what's happened on the journey. Yeah, there you go.
That's a yes then.
That's a yes. I think they're. I don't think a great novel necessarily needs to have a happy ending.
I think
life's more complicated.
The word ending can be a bit of a snare.
Yeah.
Because it's more, I think, what's sort of suggested by the last page, if that doesn't sound too...
Absolutely, that's what you want. That's what you want, isn't it? The ending that we're all searching for.
It's the tying it up is to be avoided. But the thing if the ending is a springboard, then that's a good feeling, I think.
Absolutely. I remember reading a book, Fathers and Sons, by, how do you pronounce? Is it Turgenev?
Turgenev, yeah.
Turgenev.
Yeah.
By Turgenev, Fathers and Sons, where the hero dies and there's still 2 pages left, and he's died, and that's awful and everything. And then it's the next morning in the village, the noises, you know, cows was taken down to graze, and a cock crowed, and so on. It's about life going on, and it made a huge impact on me when I was 18 or whatever. I read it, and I think that kind of stays with me. That's right. You want some kind of resolution, but that also points the way forward, don't you?
Yeah. Yes.
Because that's life. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to ask anything? Yes, there's a lady there.
Sadie, I was just wondering how you dealt with the pressure of winning awards with your first novel. And do you feel like, or do you already have your second novel in the bag, as it were? Or how did you feel that you followed that one?
I was lucky with that in a way, because I was well into the writing of the second one when the first one came out, because there was quite a long gap before it was published. But also, before that first book went so well, I had the demon of, no one will ever read this, and what's the point in doing this because it's all doomed to failure. And then, and later on, you sort of have the demon of it won't be as good as the last one, or everyone's really going to hate this one, and I've got away with it so far. And there's always going to be stuff to block out. And I never would see myself as award-winning, I think. I don't think it would be helpful. And you certainly can't decide to do it.
Any more? Anyone else? I'm going to see what I haven't already asked you. But if you think of anything, put your hands up.
Yes, please do. It's worse for us.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually near the beginning because Tim, I know you mentioned in an interview I found from a few years back that there are two great arenas for the novel: war and families. And most of your books have been about families, as you said so far. And Sadie, I know you've as you say, you've written about war and about families, and now, and I guess this book in a broader sense is about families and those connections and the way families influence us. Are your next books likely to touch on similar themes, do you think? Or can you say anything about what you're working on at the moment?
I'm always sort of intrigued by the idea that there would be books that aren't about families, or because we're all in one. And there are very few books, I think. I suppose there's a discussion, there's the domestic novel. I'm not quite sure what that is, because most of us live in homes. Yes, it's an interesting one. I think I'm less bereft than usual with this one because this story is, or elements of this story are carrying on. So that's the open door at the end of this one for me. I don't.
What, you mean you're going to carry on writing about Luke and Lee and New York? Okay.
Oh, so they might be fantastic. So there'll be a sequel.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I do. I know so. But yeah.
Great. Well, definitely buy this one because then you've got something to look forward to after that. And Tim, okay. Has this now whetted your appetite for historical fiction? Or do you think you're going to go back?
No, it has, weirdly. But something that intrigues me always is the element of choice that one has in what one writes about. And I always think that my novel is going to be about the ostensible subject, and it's usually about one person in particular in a group of people who's under some kind of moral pressure, some kind of point of conflict in their lives that they have to deal with it to find out who they really are. And but novel after novel takes place in a family which is breaking up, and I sort of suddenly realised I think I'm writing this novel about a man who's facing something, but it actually, his wife is leaving him, and his, parents are divorcing, whatever it is, and so one has the things that one chooses and the things that are simply given. One is just drawn to time and time again to recapitulate things. I find that fascinating.
Yes, and that odd thing that only afterward you think you've done something completely different and completely separate, and then someone says, and of course your themes.
Yes.
And you go, oh yeah, it's a fair cop.
Yes, that you're not necessarily conscious of doing,
yes,
of course,
coming
but
back
just
to damage or
the concerns
whatever,
that are always there.